Bienvenidos. So welcome to today's lecture. To introduce Dr. Lauren Nahas, one of my wonderful colleagues. She teaches English here at Santa Rosa Junior College, and she's been here for the last 3 years. She also teaches at Contra Costa College and Sonoma State University. She received her PhD in English from the University of Texas at Austin in 2012, and she's loved Gabriel Garcia Marquez's work since she first studied it as an English undergraduate major at UC San Diego. Please welcome her.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Abby, and thank you all for coming. It's really a privilege for me to get to speak on such an important work of literature. And also, I teach online, so if any of my online students have made it today, come say hi afterwards, because I never get to see your adorable faces. So, let's see. In an interview about 100 Years of Solitude, about how 100 Years of Solitude influenced his writing, the Pulitzer Prize-winning Dominican-American author Junio Diaz explains that magical realism is, quote, a political tool, one that enables Caribbean people to see things clearly in their world, a surreal world where there are more dead than living, more erasure and silence than things spoken. And it is in this sense, in my view, that 100 Years of Solitude is an act of social protest. In giving voice to events and people that have been silenced or erased by history, Garcia Marquez is making a political statement. He is challenging that erasure and silence. So, if I have a thesis, and as we all know, any good essay must have a thesis, my thesis here is that 100 Years of Solitude pushes back against the accepted history to present the people's history, a history of the people, of Colombia in particular and Latin America in general, from their perspective. I want to call attention in particular to Diaz's words here where he says that magical realism, quote, enables Caribbean people to see things clearly in their world, and consider that a bit more. First, here is a basic definition of magical realism that I've borrowed from literary scholar Stephen M. Hart. Quote, magical realism depicts reality objectively, but with a magical dimension. Now let's turn to the explanation of this strategy given by Garcia Marquez himself. In his acceptance speech for the Nobel Prize, which many of you may have been assigned by your instructors to read in connection with the novel, Garcia Marquez begins by explaining some of the fantastic descriptions of Latin America that were reported back by the early colonial explorers. For example, he says that a Florentine navigator reported seeing, quote, a creature that had the head and ears of a mule, a camel's body, the legs of a deer, and the whinny of a horse. He explains that many of the early explorers died in search of El Dorado, the legendary city of gold. However, Garcia Marquez wants to point out that these fantastic stories pale in comparison to the reality of the history of Latin America and the eccentricities of the dictators of the region. This is just one of the examples that he gives in his speech. He goes on, quote, General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, 3 times dictator of Mexico, held a magnificent funeral for the right leg that he had lost in the so-called pastry war. And finally, Garcia Marquez moves on to explain the unbelievable human tragedy that Latin America has had to endure. He says, quote, there have been 5 wars, 17 military coups. There emerged a diabolical dictator who is carrying out, in God's name, the first Latin American ethnocide of our time. In the meantime, 20 million Latin American children died before the age of 1, more than have been born in Europe since 1970, end quote. And he continues on with similarly tragic and despicable examples. He goes on to say that because of the fantastic and tragic nature of Latin America, writers from the region have, quote, had to ask but little of imagination, for our crucial problem has been a lack of conventional means to render our lives believable, end quote. This is what Diaz is referring to when he says that magical realism, quote, enables Caribbean people to see things clearly in their world. A mixture of the real and the fantastic is the only way to capture the reality of the region. Mere facts are not enough. Although Garcia Marquez's acceptance speech gives us a kind of broad strokes overview of Latin American history, I think we need to review some of the major events of that history to better understand how Garcia Marquez is engaging in social protest through the novel. So first, we're going to have a little geography lesson. So let's look at where the novel is set. I don't know about you, but if I might have a bit of trouble locating Colombia on an unmarked map. Shh, don't tell anyone that, okay? So here in green, down there in green, we can see Colombia there at the top of South America, neighboring Venezuela and Panama. And I use this close-up of the Caribbean because Colombia has a large Caribbean coastline, as you can see there. And Garcia Marquez was born and spent a lot of his childhood in that coastal region. So he identifies as a Caribbean author as well as a Latin American author. Looking at a map of the region is particularly important, I think, because Garcia Marquez is focused on Colombia to some extent, but he is really writing about the history of Latin America in general. And that is because the region has a shared history of colonial rule, of independence movements to break free from that rule, as well as a shared struggle after gaining independence to truly break free from outside influences in a period that is often referred to as the Neocolonial period. And to better understand these different periods of Latin American history, I'm going to give you an approximately 10-minute history lesson. Beginning with the colonial period and then looking into specific events that are important to Colombia and Garcia Marquez's life. Before we begin, however, I want to clarify that I'm using broad generalizations in this history of mine, which encompasses South America, Central America, and the Caribbean. So all of those areas are included in Latin America. So several hundred years and a lot of different countries. So it's a very general history. All right, so the colonial period of Latin American history basically begins with the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492, as we well know. Columbus's arrival marked the beginning of about 300 years of colonial rule, mainly by the Spanish, British, and Portuguese, but also by the Dutch, French, Danish, and other European powers. This map illustrates the areas of Latin America that were controlled by the various colonial powers, and as you can see, Spain had control over much of Latin America. So yeah, Spain is there represented by the yellow areas. Portuguese rule is represented by the purple area, and then we have the British, the Dutch, and the French. By the 1820s, most of the country in Latin America had gained their independence from colonial powers, okay? But even though these countries were technically politically independent, they remained economically dependent on outsiders. This economic influence came mainly from Britain initially, and later, and some people argue that this is still the case to some extent, the United States has influenced the region economically and politically. So when I was doing my research, I was asking myself, okay, so the U.S. is influencing these countries. So how does the U.S. do that? How does it exert control over? How does it exert economic and political control over all of these various Latin American countries. So that question has a two-part answer. First, in 1823, the US adopts the Monroe Doctrine. Anybody remember that one from high school history? The Monroe Doctrine was a key element of US foreign policy. And the Monroe Doctrine basically said to Europe, you know, Latin America is within our sphere of influence, so you can't be creating any more colonies here, essentially. Although the stated purpose was to preserve the newly established independence of these former colonies, the reality is that the Monroe Doctrine was essentially gave the U.S. privileged access to the economic opportunities in Latin America. And then the other part of the answer to my question was, in addition to the impact of the Monroe Doctrine, I learned that in general, during the period following colonial rule, many Latin American countries were oligarchies, so ruled by the wealthy, by the rich, all right? The elite families who had held positions of power under colonial rule generally continued to hold those positions of power during the post-colonial period. Investments from foreign countries like the US and Britain were profitable for this elite class, so they made it easy for foreign investors to have access to their country's natural resources and cheap labor. And as Longley explains, he's one of the historians I consulted in my research, he says, quote, as economic investment increased, so did US government efforts to create a favorable business environment in Latin America, end quote. In general, these foreign interests blocked industrialization in these areas so that they could import the abundance of natural resources while exporting finished goods to those areas. Thus, despite the fact that these countries were now formally independent, external economic forces determined many of their domestic policies in Latin America. And this, let's see, where's our map? This map illustrates some of the U.S.'s interventions in Latin America. So you can see that there are a lot of them. This is only a brief period. Actually, this only represents a brief period. I found all sorts of maps that would focus on particular periods of time and map U.S. interventions into Latin America. And it is here that my little history of Latin America begins to overlap with the life of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. He was born in Aracataca, Colombia, in an area called the Banana Zone, a name it was given because of the large number of foreign fruit companies that had established themselves in the area. So Garcia Marquez was literally born into this neocolonial period, where a U.S. company, the United Fruit Company, exerted extensive control over the area, providing work for the majority of the population, but also maintaining total control over their pay, working conditions, and general treatment. The massacre of the banana workers who went on strike in the novel actually happened in 1928, the same year that Garcia Marquez was born. And in a 1988 interview, he explains that it was this area, his birthplace in the Banana Zone, that inspired him to write about real life. Garcia Marquez was inspired by the writing of William Faulkner, who wrote about life in the Deep South. So it was an American writer who was a large impact on his writing. And in this interview, Garcia Marquez explains that later in life, he returned to Aracataca with his mother, and he found, quote, the atmosphere, the decadence, the heat in the village were roughly the same as what I had felt in Faulkner. It was a banana plantation region inhabited by a lot of Americans from the fruit companies, which gave it the same sort of atmosphere I had found in the writers of the Deep South. The similar atmosphere that as he calls it in this quote, I believe refers to the connections he saw between the inequalities present in the South between blacks and whites that are represented in Faulkner's novels, and the inequalities between the local Colombian population and the foreign fruit company employees. And we'll return to the massacre of the banana workers a bit later in my talk, but to continue our brief history, after World War II, dissatisfaction with the rule of the elite class and the interventions into their countries by foreign economic powers grew, and socialist revolutionary movements grew throughout Latin America. In general, these movements sought to restructure old class divisions, institute various social reforms that would benefit the majority of the population, and increase mass participation in government. These movements took various forms throughout Latin America, but the most successful Latin American revolution during the period occurred in Cuba, where revolutionary fighters managed to remove US-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista. The Cuban Revolution inspired revolutionary movements throughout Latin America, and many socialist leaders were elected in the region during the 1960s. However, through military, political, and economic interventions, in many cases, the US worked to overthrow these leaders and replace them with military dictators who were favorable to US interests. And it is during this period of repression and upheaval that Garcia Marquez writes 100 Years of Solitude. The novel is, as I said, it's produced during this period of great unrest, but it's also important to acknowledge that Garcia Marquez develops as a writer during this period of unrest. So let's zoom in a little bit to look at some of the major events of Garcia Marquez's life that preceded the publication of 100 Years of Solitude, and also at events in Colombian history to better understand the context in which he was writing. Garcia Marquez established himself as a journalist throughout the 1940s and 50s, working at various publications in Colombia, and he also experienced firsthand the unrest in Colombia. After the assassination of a politician, rioters in Bogota started a fire in the building where Garcia Marquez lived, destroying his manuscripts. So the violence sort of touched his life in a very personal manner in that way. Those riots are understood as the beginning of a 10-year period of civil war between the Colombian Conservative Party and the Colombian Liberal Party, both of which make an appearance in 100 Years of Solitude. This period of civil war is referred to as La Violencia, and most of the battles occurred in the countryside. We kind of see that in the novel as well. And it is estimated that 200,000 people died in these conflicts. Garcia Marquez was also an active supporter of the socialist revolutionary movements, and much of his journalism was critical of conservative ruling parties and neocolonial interventions in Latin America. He wrote for the Cuban, for example, he wrote for the Cuban newspaper La Prensa after the Cuban Revolution, and he was a friend of Fidel Castro's, I hear. Apparently, he was not very pleased with Fidel Castro's views on freedom of speech. Let's see, where are we? So he saw firsthand, and as a journalist, he saw firsthand and as a journalist the constant upheaval that Latin America was experienced during this period, revolutionary movements, the rise and fall of various elected leaders, as well as dictators. So this is the history that Garcia Marquez is trying to document in 100 Years of Solitude. Via magical realism, he is able to present both the beauty and passion of the region, but also its often tragic circumstances and inconsistencies. And now our history lesson is over. Let's return to the basic definition of magical realism, the tool that Garcia Marquez uses to represent this complex, contradictory, and surreal history. So here's that quote again. Magical realism depicts reality objectively, but with a magical dimension. So this is what magical realism does. It mixes the real with the fantastic, and in particular presents the fantastic as natural, as mundane, as ordinary. And before we look at specific examples of Garcia Marquez's use of magical realism in the novel, to comment on and point out the injustices, abuses, and inconsistencies present in Latin American history, let's look at exactly how he does that. How does he use magical realism to make the fantastic seem realistic? As he himself explains, quote, "The tone that I eventually used in 100 Years of Solitude was based on the way my grandmother used to tell stories. She told things that sounded supernatural and fantastic, but she told them with complete naturalness." And he also explains that it is the specific details in his descriptions that make it believable, that make magical realism believable. So when he writes that Mauricio Babylonia is followed wherever he goes by yellow butterflies, it is the specific detail that they are yellow that makes it more realistic. And as the literary scholar Hart explains, during the explanation of Remedios' ascension, Garcia Marquez describes the specific details of her saying goodbye to her sister, the detailed description of the garden, and even a specific time of day is given to make the scenario more believable to the reader. And those examples that I just gave are examples of fantastic but benign, harmless, magical events. So through the mixture of both very dark, sinister, and violent fantastic events, with these more beautiful, fanciful examples of magic, all of them become more believable and vivid. There is also a mixture of more and less outrageous events in the book. For example, compare Remedios' ascension with Colonel Aureliano Buendia's demand that his assistants draw a 10-foot diameter circle around him wherever he goes, so that no one is permitted to enter. Both of these things are absurd, but one is clearly more plausible than the other. So he uses various types of mixtures in making magical realism seem somewhat plausible. And that brings me back to the earlier definition of magical realism and the ways literary scholars have explained its purpose in relation to social protest. So here are a couple. This one is from Conniff. He says, the book is a calculated attempt to make the outrages of oppression, ancient and recent, visible again. It is an attempt to make Colombian history credible or believable, right? And here's another. Magical realism is used to, quote, draw attention to ideological rifts within a given society. What exists for one group does not exist for another. Okay, so he wants to draw out that contrast through magical realism. So with those definitions in mind, and now that we're done with our historical tour and discussion of Garcia Marquez's techniques, we'll take a closer look at the novel and a few examples of social protest within the novel. And I'm going to separate my analysis into 3 different sections. First, we'll look at the criticism of neocolonial, First, we'll look at the criticism of la violencia. Then we'll briefly discuss how Garcia Marquez mocks and draws attention to the brutality and absurd eccentricities of Latin America's many dictators. And finally, we'll look at the criticism of neocolonialism in the novel. Okay. And I view the long section of the novel that covers Colonel Aureliano Buendia's military career as a commentary on and criticism of la violencia, the constant civil wars, mainly occurring in the countryside, that served as the backdrop of Garcia Marquez's early adulthood in Colombia. However, I think that this section serves as a criticism of the constant disputes, wars, civil wars, and unrest throughout Latin America in general as well. When I read that section, I see a consistent focus on the lack of reasoning behind the war. And part of the magical realism of that section is the way in which Colonel Aureliano Buendia embraces this lack of reason as he is more deeply enveloped in his solitude as a leader of the war. Here are the first explanations of the differences between liberals and conservatives, as explained by Don Apolinar, Colonel Aureliano Buendia's father-in-law, who is a conservative. The liberals, he said, were Freemasons, bad people, wanting to hang priests, to institute civil marriage and divorce, to recognize the rights of illegitimate children as equal to those legitimate ones, and to cut the country up into a federal system that would take power away from the supreme authority. The conservatives, on the other hand, who had received their power directly from God, proposed the establishment of public order and family morality. They were the defenders of the faith of Christ, of the principle of authority, and were not prepared to permit the country to be broken down into autonomous entities. And I imagine that these descriptions were probably really funny to a Colombian reader of 100 Years of Solitude, especially during that period of time. But as outsiders, I think it's still clear that these descriptions are probably exaggerations or are at least partially based on the realities of the two groups' beliefs. At this point, Colonel Aureliano Buendia is put off by the two groups' beliefs as a reason to go to war. And Garcia Marquez writes that Aureliano could not understand how people arrived at the extreme of waging war over things that could not be touched with a hand. But eventually he decides, if I have to be something, I'll be a liberal, he said, because the conservatives are tricky. So early on in his contact with the war, he thinks the entire thing is absolutely absurd, that there's no real reason to support one side or the other. For me, the shift in Colonel Aureliano Buendia's personality and perspective comes after he kills the conservative soldiers in retribution for murders that had been committed in Macondo. It is then that he announces that he is no longer Aureliano and will from then on be known as Colonel Aureliano Buendia. The ambiguity over what conservatives stand for and what liberals stand for and who is in the right continues to worsen in that section of the novel, especially under Arcadio's liberal dictatorship. And if you're wondering which Arcadio, I know what you mean. I mean the one that is Jose Arcadio's son by Pilar Ternera, but I actually think there's two of those, so you got to go back and look at the book. Arcadio's actions when he is left in control of Macondo by the liberals makes it clear that neither the conservatives nor the liberals are virtuous. So if you remember, Colonel Aureliano Buendia leaves to go off to war, and he leaves Arcadio in control of the town. So Arcadio is representing the liberal side of this war. And for example, Arcadio creates legalized titles for the lands that Jose Arcadio has taken from other residents of Macondo. So he took them illegally, right? Arcadio, however, is a representative of the liberals who should be fighting for the rights of the peasants. At least it seems he should be. The ambiguity of the war, of the purpose of the war, continues to develop through a conversation between Colonel Aureliano Buendia and his friend Colonel Hernaldo. And here's this long quotation that I think is very interesting. One night he asked Colonel Hernaldo, "Tell me something, old friend, why are you fighting?" "What other reason could there be?" Colonel Hernaldo Marquez answered, "For the great liberal party." "You're lucky because you know why," he answered. "As far as I'm concerned, I've come to realize only just now that I'm fighting because of pride." "That's bad," Colonel Hernaldo Marquez said. Colonel Aureliano Buendia was amused at his alarm. "Naturally," he said, "but in any case, it's better than not knowing why you're fighting." He looked at him in the eyes and added with a smile, or fighting like you for something that doesn't have any meaning for anyone. In the final step in Colonel Aureliano Buendia's decline comes after he demonstrates new levels of brutality by killing his friend simply because he's a conservative, and shortly after being asked about changes to the liberal objectives, which will essentially make them the same as the conservatives' objectives, he says, "That means," Colonel Aureliano Buendia said, smiling when the reading was over, "that all we're fighting for is power." So to me, this section of the novel is clearly a form of protest against the la violencia. And Garcia Marquez's purpose is to point out that there was little reasoning or purpose behind all of that violence and death. And then, oh, well, we can't go there yet. I wanted to discuss briefly the criticism of dictatorships that I see happening through Colonel Aureliano Buendia. He represents the dictators that have been so prevalent in Latin American history, not only because of his brutality and his lust for war and carnage, but also through his eccentricities and excesses. I noted earlier his demand that the 10-foot diameter chalk circle be drawn around him wherever he went, and no one was allowed to enter that circle. And this strikes me as very similar to some of the crazy demands that many of the more notorious Latin American dictators made. And I mean, honestly, dictators anywhere in the world made crazy demands throughout history. It also clearly shows that his solitude has reached another level, and he has found a way to clearly draw a line, literally draw a line cutting himself off from other people and from a shared reality with those people. So that's one of Garcia Marquez's major points there, at least in my view. And then we will discuss the massacre of the banana workers. Garcia Marquez's representation of the massacre of the banana workers in 1928 both is and is not an example of magical realism. This is because, to a great extent, Garcia Marquez simply told the story of the poor treatment of the workers, the United Fruit Company's refusal to acknowledge their complaints, and the collaboration of the Colombian government and army with the foreign company against their own citizens. It is widely accepted that Garcia Marquez simply wanted to draw attention back to this event, which had been removed from Colombian history books. In his description of the lead up to the massacre, it's generally accepted as basically factually accurate. But Garcia Marquez has acknowledged that he has exaggerated some details. So he basically just simply told the story. There are relatively few elements of magical realism in that aspect of the book. For example, his descriptions of how the head of the United Fruit Company, Mr. Brown, attempted to evade signing a document acknowledging the workers' complaints, they're quite funny. He says, quote, "Later on, Mr. Brown was surprised traveling incognito in a third-class coach, and they made him sign another copy of the demands. On the following day, he appeared before the judges with his hair dyed black and speaking flawless Spanish. The authors showed that the man was not Mr. Jack Brown, the superintendent of United Fruit Company, born in Prattville, Alabama, but a harmless vendor of medicinal plants, born in Macon, and baptized there with the name of Dagoberto Fonseca. The situation is absurd. The company's lawyers are willing to argue that this man is someone else in order to avoid acknowledging the situation of the workers." However, another aspect of the United Fruit Company's evasions that appears in the novel is based on reality. In court, it says, quote, "The sleight of hand lawyers proved that the demands lack all validity for the simple reason that the banana company did not have never have, and never would have any workers in its service because they were all hired on a temporary and occasional basis. So an actual Colombian court did come to this conclusion during sort of the lead up to the strike and the lead up to the massacre. So that was an actual court decision. Let's see, an issue in Garcia Marquez's representation of the massacre that was addressed by many scholars in my research is that the novel says that the number of people killed in the massacre was 3,000. There are official documents that have the number of dead at 47. Others say that it was over 1,000. Garcia Marquez himself has explained that for him the total number of people killed is irrelevant, in that there is clearly no acceptable number of people to murder under these circumstances, or, maybe any circumstances. But also, from a writer's perspective, he wanted the image of a train full of bodies being carried away from the scene of the crime. And thus he used the number 3,000, which is the largest number reported by investigations at that time. So I know he's explained that he did quite a bit of research trying to look into the details of the reports and investigations after the massacre to try and verify these numbers. There's a lot of sort of controversy about those numbers still to this day. Garcia Marquez used magical realism in his description of Jose Arcadio Segundo's activities after the event as the sole survivor of the massacre. His mother hides him in an unused room in the Buendia house. When a soldier who had served under Colonel Aureliano Buendia comes to search the house, Jose Arcadio Segundo prepares to be caught and sits in the middle of the room in plain sight of the soldier. However, the soldier does not see him, even though Jose Arcadio Segundo is looking right at him and other family members are present. The officer comments, "It's obvious that no one has been in this room for at least 100 years. And it is explained that the reason that the soldier couldn't see Jose Arcadio Segundo is that, quote, the young officer had seen the room with the same eyes as Colonel Aureliano Buendia. So that's the quote that explains why the soldier couldn't see Jose Arcadio Segundo. This quote is critical for interpreting this section as an example of social protest related to the purpose of magical realism. Hart interprets the soldier's inability to see Jose Arcadio Segundo as an example of, quote, the ideological rifts within a given society. What exists for one group does not exist for another. The soldier, a position of power, does not see what Jose Arcadio Segundo's family members see. To him, Jose Arcadio Segundo is a ghost. He's invisible. And I think this is possibly the ultimate example of the presence of social protest in the novel. Garcia Marquez uses magical realism to reveal the perspective of the group that has been, to return to the quote from Junio Diaz that we started with, silenced and erased. Thank you. And if any of you are interested in looking at my sources, I can send you my works cited page. You would just have to email me here. Oh, it's cut off a little bit. It's just lnahas@santarosa.edu. So we're going to ask for questions. Does anyone have any questions that they want to ask? I think we have plenty of time for them. Yeah, Abby.
Okay, so the last point you made about the soldier not seeing Segundo, could you explain that a little further? I didn't quite get it.
So let's go back to our quote. So this is sort of Junio Diaz's interpretation of the usefulness of magical realism. It's a political tool, one that enables Caribbean people to see things clearly in their world, a surreal world where there are more dead than living. There's more erasure and silence than things spoken. And so in that example where the soldier can't see Jose Arcadio Segundo, he's silenced, he is invisible, he is erased, right? And the soldier literally can't see him. So it's an example of how Marquez is using an example of magical realism to kind of show the problem in this situation. Oh, she's asking, and I should be repeating questions. Is the soldier a representative of the conservatives or the liberals? Well, he fought under colonial, if you look at that passage really carefully, he fought under Colonel Aureliano Buendia. In that scene, he talks about admiring Colonel Aureliano Buendia, so he is a liberal. And so now, if you think about that a little bit, a soldier from the Liberal Party is defending the interests of a U.S. fruit company and oppressing these striking workers. So it's another example of how things sort of get mixed up in the fog of war a bit. Any more questions? No? Yeah.
Why do you think magical realism developed as sort of an exclusively Latin American thing, and other oppressed groups in other parts of the world didn't have a similar style?
What I came across in doing, your question was, why do I think magical realism seems to be a phenomena of Latin American writing in particular? Actually, there's a lot of criticism, literary criticism that argues that it is not unique to Latin America, that is actually really common in, I would say, literature of the third world or of oppressed peoples. So you see it throughout Caribbean literature. I looked at an article that was analyzing its use in the work of Toni Morrison, an African-American writer here in the United States. And it's also apparent in African literature as well. So it seems to be this tool, it is in general a tool where a writer pushes back against an accepted history. And for these, colonized and oppressed peoples, they use it to sort of talk about their perspective and push back against that history. It's used like over and over and over in those types of, I think you would define it as third world literature or something along those lines. That was a good question. Anybody else? All right. Thank you so much for coming. Have a good evening. Oh, do you have something to say before you run off?
Thank you, Lauren. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to also mention that Equity, SRJC Equity helped our lectures, and the Robert C. Kelly Foundation supported them as well. The English department does a work of literary merit every semester. Next semester, we are going to be reading Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me for the WOLM. So looking forward to see you then. And thanks again. Thank you to Lauren.